What's up, guys? Shawn, Myszka, Movement Mastery and OptimizeMovement.com coming to you with this week's quick tip. And this week's quick tip deals with the analysis of movement and what specific questions you as a movement specialist need to ask yourself with each and every movement pattern and movement skill and movement action that you see occurring when you are analyzing sport movement. Now, I always say that if we know what to look for and how to analyze the actual sport movement taking place, as well as what it tells us about that respective athlete in his or her environment, that the sport movement is truly the only screen that we need. If we know what to look for in the displayed characteristics of that movement optimization model, it's going to tell us a host of information regarding the biodynamic structure of how that athlete is interacting in the sport environment, which is the context that matters to us the most. It can tell us different things, more specific things than the base level factors and considerations that most people look at when they're just haphazardly, recreationally watching sport movement take place. You know, anyone can tell planes of motion or overall control of movement or base information regarding force development. But if we ask the right questions in regards to those things that are impacting the displayed characteristics of the sport movement taking place, such as the kinetics, the kinematics, and the kinesiological pattern, we're going to know how those three things and the factors of each one of those are determining to the contribution to the display that we're seeing. It's also going to help us to troubleshoot exactly what needs to go on, what factors we need to attack when we look at our path and our process towards attaining movement optimization. Now, when we look at these questions, we're going to find out rather quickly that each one kind of deals with another factor or aspect of that display that we're seeing, as well as those deterministic factors, the kinetics, the kinematics, and the kinesiological pattern. And if you haven't watched that movement optimization model video lately, go ahead and do so to give yourself a quick update and a quick refresher. But essentially, each one of these questions allows us to determine either subjectively or objectively, or qualitatively or quantitatively, exactly how efficient the movement that we're seeing taking place really is. It's going to tell us if the input of the athlete is matching the output that we're seeing being displayed. We're going to see things and ideas of balance, mobility, and stability. We're also going to see exactly what's contributing beyond the athlete's base of support, as well as his or her center of gravity and the control of it, as well as then force characteristics such as eccentric versus concentric, force absorption versus force development, or absorption versus exertion. So some of these ideas are going to kind of unfold as we pull back the layers of that movement optimization model and ask ourselves very detailed questions regarding the analysis of that movement taking place. So now on to the questions. Now, I will say that some of these are highly speculative. It's going to require you to watch, as a movement specialist, you're going to have to watch tons of athletes moving, both live action as well as then the tape or reproduction in the slow motion of video in order to see exactly what's occurring and get an accurate representation of what's occurring when we attempt to answer these questions. But anytime that I'm watching my athletes on film performing their sport movement patterns and actions and skills, these are the very same questions that I'm asking myself in looking to think about or try to assess exactly where it is that we need to go, myself as a movement specialist and that athlete as someone who's trying to move up in ladder of level of movement mastery. The first question is were there any preliminary movement actions taking place that aren't contributing to the sport movement action? And now we must remember that some preliminary movement actions that take place before the production of the actual execution of the sports skill are definitely necessary, and they can benefit what it is that we're doing as an athlete. So we have to make sure that we make this determination what preliminary movement actions were taking place prior to the movement pattern being produced that we're analyzing, as well as if it was beneficial or if it's something that we want to look to avoid because it might be related to question number 2, is were there any apparent energy leaks? Now again, this is something that when you're watching it live action to the naked eye, you might not be able to see that energy leak. But if you break it down and look at it slow motion and go frame by frame through that analysis of that video, you might find that there's energy leaks all over the place. And this is something that I find even with my professional NFL football players, is we will see very apparent energy leaks when we break it down in slow motion. Things that we can look to avoid if we look at the right factors that are contributing to it. So question 1, were there any preliminary movement actions? Question 2 kind of builds on that, is where, if any, were there apparent energy leaks? Third, furthermore, down the list here is, were there any actions occurring that could potentially lead to injury? Because we know that just because something, there might be a compensation in a movement, that it might not necessarily be dysfunctional. But if it is dysfunctional, it can become dangerous. So just because something might be inefficient doesn't mean that that's where we start when we look at the addressing of movement mastery or the addressing of issues that could be holding us back from movement mastery. But if there were actions that could be leading to injury, this is often the first place that I would implore you to begin. When I see extreme knee valgus or something of that nature, or a huge collapse at the ankle, or something is occurring to where the athlete isn't in the right place at the right time, and they could be subjecting themselves to dangerous compressive forces or something of the like, these are things that I look to address almost immediately because I know that that's likely our lowest hanging fruit. Question 4 is, were joint angles being produced or used that are going to optimize strength characteristics? Now we know that every athlete has specific anthropometric features as well as length, tension, and force coupling relationships that are particular to him or her as an athlete. But what we do know as well is that there's going to be certain accentuated regions of force, or accentuated regions of force capability rather, that are going to be productive for the production of some movement skills, as well as some movement acts and patterns. So we want to look to use joint angles that are going to optimize force development per the context of the movement pattern taking place. To add on to this, we look at the timing and sequencing, the kinematic structure, if you will, of the joint actions. And was it optimal? Were we working from proximal to distal? Or were there certain things that were occurring where we were having joint actions in body segments producing force before they were supposed to and before prime movers could actually contribute to the movement pattern? This is a very vital and important question to take into consideration, because if we don't, some of these other things aren't actually they're going to be a moot point, because we're never going to be able to get to that point if the timing and sequence of the actual kinematic structure, the kinematic chain, was going to be most optimal. Okay? Moving on, we look at where's force being produced and at what velocity. So how is force being produced in the action? Okay, what was the eccentric, the isometric, and the concentric? Where was the force coming to contribute to those movement or those muscle actions? As well as in what about the respective movement actions? Absorption, stabilization, and exertion. Okay, and what kind of rate was each one of those phases occurring in? Because we know that in most sport movement actions, they're very dynamic and very ballistic. Do we need to move with greater intention, or do we need to produce that through training? Okay, things for us to think about. Number 7 here kind of builds on number 6, is was force being produced then at the optimal moment? This also takes into consideration number 4, which was were there joint angles being used which will optimize strength? Because again, remember, as some of the laws of dynamic correspondence would tell us, is that the accentuated region of force production is vitally important to ensuring that we optimize movement. So we don't want to have any wasted movement actions, but we want to ensure that we're utilizing the actual joint angles that are going to optimize strength, and that will allow us to produce force at the most optimal moment in the sport movement action. We see a lot of athletes overexert themselves at certain regions of the actual production or movement action that then throws off or sways the display of the entire movement pattern. So something vital for us to think about. Two more questions here. Number 8, can additional force assist in or be produced to assist in the displayed characteristics that we're seeing taking place? Another big key point is sometimes people think that we just want more force. That's not often vital. Sometimes it can be, but we got to make that determination. Is can additional force be produced in the action? And are we going to be able to use it based on our kinematic structure? Because if our kinematic structure doesn't match our kinetic structure, additional force likely isn't going to actually assist us. We need to make sure that the kinematic structure is in line first, as I told you earlier. But once we do that, can we produce additional force? If so, how so? And can it actually assist in and add to the displayed characteristics that we're seeing? And finally, maybe the most important question that we need to ask ourselves, especially with pre-programmed chaotic conditioned sports such as American football, soccer, rugby, basketball, those things, most sports, guys and gals, is how did the kinesiological pattern change? Meaning, how did the cognitive or perceptual demands impact the displayed characteristics of the sport movement action taking place? Huge for us to answer. I find that most movement analysis often look at the detailed questions up to that point, and they forget about the actual kinesiological pattern. Remember what that kinesiological patterning is. It's how well the sensory system in the brain is able to process information. It's able to make decisions. It's able to perceive and anticipate and solve problems in the sporting environment. Because we often see athletes who look great kinetically and kinematically when they don't have to worry about the cognitive and perceptual demands. But once we throw that into the mix, movement strategies get skewed a little bit, and it can change the entire displayed characteristics that we're witnessing, the displayed characteristics of that movement optimization model. So movement masters out there, I just go ahead and ask myself all of these questions. Again, some of them I can measure, and then some of them I have to speculate and subjectively, qualitatively determine and put myself out there on a limb to determine what exactly may be occurring. Okay? So all things for us to think about. I hope you enjoyed this quick tip. For Shawn, Myszka, and Movement Mastery, this has been OptimizeMovement.com with another quick tip. So till next time, Movement Masters, let's go out and get it, and let's all continue to master the art of optimizing movement.